said to you for refuge, to Jesus hath fled.
Okay, so I am looking forward to this. Jennifer Michelle Greenberg, looking forward to introducing her. Jennifer survived 21 years of child abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. And somehow God gave her the faith she needed to endure this terrible ordeal and to recover. Not just to survive, but to recover. And people like Jennifer are amazing to me. I don't know how they can even function. I grew up in an idyllic childhood, and I have trouble functioning. So I don't know how somebody has gone through what Jennifer has gone through. It turns out this way. It's awesome. It's just awesome. My heroes. So not only has she survived, but she has thrived. She's had several award-winning albums. She's about ready to release her fourth solo album, Symbiotic. And also this year is kind of special because on September 1 she'll release her debut book, Not Forsaken. The book chronicles the spiritual and emotional recovery milestones following abuse and trauma. It's going to be neat. I will buy that for sure. So anybody's interested in that, it comes out September 1. You can talk to Jennifer about that. It'll be a great book. She's been reviewed by Christianity Today and the Houston Chronicle. She's been featured on several media shows, including NPR, Fox 26, and Great Day Houston. And she's been commended by our own President George W. Bush and by Sarah Palin for her charitable work. She and her husband Jason is here with her today. Glad you're here. They have 3 little girls, beautiful little girls. I got to meet them last month at our meeting. And they live in Houston and attend Cornerstone Orthodox Presbyterian Church. It's my pleasure to give you Jennifer Greenberg.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today. I am very honored that you guys invited me and that you're here to hear my story. So as Paul said, my name is Jennifer Michelle Greenberg, and I'm a local homeschool mom and singer-songwriter and pending author. And actually, they moved my release date up for the book to August 20th. So I don't know, I guess they're really excited about it. But yes, so I survived 21 years of child abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. But I'm not here today to tell you a lot of shocking stories. I'll tell you a few just to give you some context. I'm certainly not here to get you down. Actually, what I'm here to tell you about today is how God uses suffering, how He is sovereign, and how He uses even the evil deeds of evil people to orchestrate His holy will. And so I'll start with a story of something that happened when I was about 11 years old. It was a weekend. My dad was home from work, and I was playing in the living room, and he was reading a theology book on the couch. Our family was church-going, read the Bible every day, went to church every Sunday without fail, sometimes even Sunday evenings too. So by all appearances, we were a happy, normal, healthy family to our community, to our pastors, to our friends. But that day in the living room, I was playing, and I remember my dad said, "Be quiet. I'm trying to read." And I'm sure many of you have children. You know what happens when you tell a kid to be quiet, right? They're quiet for maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 if you're lucky. But then they start giggling and they start singing songs and being ruckus again. And that's exactly what happened. And so, I was having fun. I was off in my own little world. And all of a sudden, my dad grabbed me by the arm. And he jerked me around. And he just started hitting me. And I remember thinking, in my child's mind, it's going to be fine. I've been spanked before. It's no big deal. He'll hit me 2 or 3 times and then I'll go back to playing, I'll get through this. It'll be fine. But that's not what happened. He kept hitting. And I started to scream. And I was terrified, wondering when he was going to let the pain stop. I remember wondering that. When will he let me not be hurting? And finally, my mom ran into the room and she said, "What are you doing?" And he dropped me. And I fell on the floor. And I was so upset, I scrambled up and I ran to my bedroom. And I huddled by the closet door on the floor. And I listened to them yell in the living room. And after some time, the yells died down, and I waited for somebody to come give me a hug, tell me that they were sorry, tell me that it was going to be okay, that this was going to be dealt with, maybe bring me an ice pack, some ibuprofen. But I sat there, and I just remember looking at my arm and seeing the bruises already there. And I matched each of my fingers up to those bruises. And I thought, this is how big my dad's hands are. And I did that on my arm, and all down my side, and on my back, and the back of my leg. Hand-shaped welts and bruises. And around this same time, I started to find pornography on my computer. Now, we were a homeschool family, so we had one family computer, and we each had a desktop, right? You go to the computer and you put in your password and you log into your desktop, and that's how we did our homework. We would write our school reports, and maybe I'd research an animal or a historical event or something that I was writing about. I loved writing even then. But I would find these JPEGs saved to my desktop. And I still remember the first one that I found. It was called Brittany's C Word. And at 11, 12 years old, I didn't know what the C word was. I had no idea. So I opened that JPEG. And I was shocked by what I saw. And it was violent. And the women in those pictures, at least I think they were women, but they looked like teenage girls. They looked like how I would look in just a few years. And so this really messed with my head. And sometimes I would catch my dad watching me find those images. So I knew, I don't think I had quite consciously admitted it to myself, but I knew in my head that my dad was responsible for this and that he did it on purpose. But God was with me. And God is faithful. And I had always believed in God, and I always loved Jesus for as long as I remember. I don't have a big, surprising, date in my life when, boom, suddenly I realized that I was a Christian. I don't remember a day that I didn't love Jesus, and I think there's a reason for that. I think it's because God knew that if He didn't give me faith from a very young age, I might never have been saved. And so around this time, I had an epiphany kind of in my life. I stayed up one night, I stayed up until 2 or 3 in the morning, weeping and praying. And I told God, this man in my life, this guy that I called Dad, he's not my dad. He's a stranger, and he's dangerous. And I don't feel safe, and I don't feel like he loves me. And you know, it's kind of funny, even at that time, I had heard my parents talking about teenagers, right? And all the trouble teenagers get into. And I had friends who had older siblings. So I was really worried. You know, here I was, 11, 12 years old, and I was really worried about what would happen to me if I went through my middle school, teenage years in that environment. And I told God, I need you to be my daddy. I need you to protect me, to give me wisdom, to give me faith, to make me strong, to make me feel loved. Because if I don't feel loved, I'm going to be lost. And so what I experienced that night, you know, it wasn't a profound vision. It wasn't even a Bible verse that came to mind. It was just a feeling of peace that washed over me. And I knew that God was real, that God was in my life, and that He loved me, and that He was my Father. But you might be thinking, there's a problem here though, right? Because even though I had faith, even though God gave me this incredible hope, despite what was going on in my life, the abuse I was enduring was doing damage to me emotionally and spiritually that I had no way of calculating. Because how do you understand that God is your Father when the example of fatherhood in your life is violent and cruel? How do you understand what it means that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, became man when your concept, your perception of masculinity and manhood is being portrayed by someone who is perverse and selfish? And so even though I knew on some level that God was my Father, in many ways I didn't understand what that even meant. And you know, fast forward 10 years, at 21 years of age, I married Jason. And we had dated for about 3 years. And I still remember the first time we went on a date. And he was driving me, I don't remember where it was, probably to a movie theater, maybe a restaurant. And he was driving the speed limit. And he wasn't flipping people off. And he wasn't getting mad. And I just remember thinking, who is this guy? You know, this is weird. Here's this guy he's patient. He's not getting angry in situations where I had my dad continually blow his top. You know, and Jason was kind to me. He listened to me. He wanted to know my ideas and my thoughts, and I'd never experienced that before. But like I said, perception is very important. Because you see, my dad would teach Sunday school classes at our church, and he acted really nice when he was at church, right? He acted professionally when he was at work. When we went and had dinner with friends, he was nice. You know, he wasn't the life of the party or anything like that, but he was decent. Nobody suspected he was violent to his kids. And so I kind of thought, even though I knew and I loved Jason, even though I knew he was a good man, I still kind of, I think, in the back of my head, subconsciously, expected that once we were in private, once we were married, I'd meet the real guy. Because you see, I was taught that my dad was a good man. I was taught that my dad was a godly man. But by logical implication, if my dad was a godly man, if my dad was normal, then all men were abusers. And bad men were really bad. So you see, the perception of a child abuse victim, and really any abuse victim, the perspective is very skewed. Your measure of normal is out of whack. And so I was very afraid to tell anybody what was going on, because I thought if I told somebody that, my dad had thrown me down the stairs or beat me or was, saving porn to my computer, I thought they'd be like, well, Jennifer, this is normal. You realize that this is normal, right? You're complaining for no reason. It's not that big of a deal. That's what I expected, or rather, that's what I feared would happen. And so I stayed quiet for a very long time. And of course, the other fear was, well, if you go to the police, if you tell them what's going on, what are they going to do? They show up at your house with their notebooks. They take notes. Well, what if they don't have enough evidence to charge him? What if they leave? And then you're alone in the house with a violent man who knows that you told on him. So there was a lot of fear. And as I got to know Jason and after we got married, I started to realize I finally had an example of what a godly man was in my life. I had someone who was excited about my career, who wanted to be involved in my hobbies, who cared about my emotions, who consulted me before he bought something, even like a vacuum. He'd ask me, well, what do you want? What's best for our family? What's best for our marriage? What should we do? And I'd never had anybody consult me like that before or care about my ideas, my opinion. And so I learned by contrast, because finally I knew what a godly man was, I realized what an ungodly man my father had been. And it broke my heart. Because when a parent, whether they're your mom or your dad, or a loved one, maybe a husband or wife, a brother, a sister, a friend, you don't want to believe that they're abusive. You want to chalk it up to a bad day, stress at work, too much alcohol, whatever. It doesn't matter how silly the excuse is. You will look for excuses because you desperately want that person to be okay. Because you love them. And suddenly I realized that my dad was ungodly. And I became very angry at God. There's a story in the Bible in Genesis. It's the story of Joseph. And I know most, if not all of y'all here today are Christians, but I want to share this story with you because it means a lot to me personally. Joseph, when he was a young man, he was doted on by his father. That's not the part that I relate with, by the way. He was given gifts. He was his father's favorite son, and he had 10 older brothers. You have to understand, it was usually the oldest brother, right? The firstborn who was supposed to be the special one. But Joseph's father prized him above all his sons. And that made Joseph's brothers insanely jealous, to the point that they actually plotted to murder their little brother. Can you imagine? Wanting a sibling to die. And one day in the field, they attacked Joseph. They beat him up, they tore off his clothes, and they threw him in a pit. And they were planning to kill him. I don't know what they were doing. They were probably, sitting around the top of this pit having sandwiches or something. And when along came a caravan of slave traders. And they thought, oh, well, we don't need to kill Joseph, right? Let's make this easy. We'll sell him into slavery. With all the abuses coming to light in the church, maybe even in some of your own churches, maybe even in some of your families, we tend to think of abuse as a modern issue, right? Me too, church too. Those are modern hashtags. But abuse, though it's a terrible issue today, it's been plaguing the people of God since Cain murdered Abel. This has been going on for a very, very long time. God is familiar with abusers. He understands hypocrites, and he sees right through them. And it's interesting, when you read the story of Joseph, you're going to notice there's a sentence that's repeated several times, and it's, "But God was with Joseph." And when those slave traders carried Joseph away to Egypt and sold him to a man named Potiphar, Genesis tells us, but God was with Joseph. And what happened was, Potiphar recognized Joseph's talents. He respected his abilities. This foreigner, this slave, he saw value in him. But I'm sure you all know the story. Potiphar's wife had very different things on the mind. She tried to seduce Joseph. Day after day, she pestered him to sleep with her. And day after day, Joseph said, "No, I will not sin against my God, and I will not betray my master." And finally, Potiphar's wife got so fed up with Joseph, she falsely accused him of rape. And once again, Joseph was taken prisoner. I'm guessing he was beat up pretty good. And he was thrown into prison, falsely accused. But God was with Joseph. And around this time, people started having really weird dreams. I always thought that was such a funny plot twist, right? You just see God working among all this sin, this mundane life, tragedy. God is working. And God gave Joseph the ability to interpret these dreams. And so his fellow inmates started asking his opinion. The prison guards started having him interpret their dreams. And word spread about Joseph's blessing until Pharaoh himself heard about Joseph, and Pharaoh started having weird dreams. And so Pharaoh called this prisoner, this slave, this foreigner out of prison and into his beautiful courtroom. And he asked Joseph to interpret his dream. And do you remember what Joseph said? He said, "I can't. God can. And I will tell you what God says. Do you understand how incredible that is? Here he is, a hostage, a slave, a Hebrew foreigner, talking to an incredibly powerful man who thinks he's a god. Pharaoh was a god to the Egyptians. So he's telling this man who could kill him like that, God is going to interpret your dream. That's pretty brave. That's pretty bold. And Pharaoh was so mind blown by Joseph's blessing, by his prophetic ability, and just his character in general. He perceived him to be a godly man. And he said, this guy doesn't belong in jail. This guy needs to be in charge of everything. He needs to be running things. And so he put Joseph in a position of high authority. And I know many of you are business owners, and so you really appreciate the fact that Joseph was very fiscally responsible. He was good at planning. He was good at allocating. He was good at organizing. And because he prophetically knew that a famine was on its way, he planned and he prepared and he set aside resources. And when famine finally swept the land, people from all over Egypt, and you know Egypt is a huge country, people from all over Egypt and even beyond Egypt's borders came to Joseph so that they would not starve. And among those crowds were Joseph's treacherous brothers. Now, you need to understand, about 40 years have passed by this time since they threw that scrawny teenage boy into the pit. Joseph has become a man. He's grown up. He probably has facial hair. He's probably got that Egyptian eyeliner on and a headdress. He looks totally different. And they have no idea who he is. But he recognizes them. And when he tells them who he is, they're terrified. And they say, Joseph, we are your slaves now. What a turning of the tables, right? They sold their own little brother into slavery, and now they're offering themselves as slaves. But you see, God was with Joseph. He'd been with Joseph when he was bumping down the road in that human trafficker's caravan. He was with Joseph at the bottom of the pit. He was with Joseph as he refused Potiphar's wife. He was with Joseph when he was falsely accused and falsely imprisoned. And he'd been working in Joseph's heart. And Joseph knew that God was sovereign over everything. God was bigger than his evil brothers. God was bigger than Potiphar's wife. God was bigger than false accusations and imprisonment. And he was able to look over his life and see that had God not orchestrated everything, had God not given him the strength to endure devastation, heartbreak, betrayal, thousands of people would have starved to death. And I want to think about that for a minute too. You know, you think about the thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who were kept alive because Joseph saved them from starvation. But now think about their children, how many children they had. The great-great-grandchildren that never would have been born. Maybe even some people in this very room who never would have existed had not Joseph been thrown into that pit, sold into slavery, put in that prison, and witnessed to Pharaoh. That's mind-blowing, right? It's incredible. And so I came to understand that in my own life. Once again, I stayed up late praying. And I remember reading the words of Paul in 2 Corinthians, I think it's chapter 12. He said, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan. 3 times I begged God to take it from me. And 3 times he said, my grace is sufficient. I think I may have prayed for my dad 3,000 times. Maybe more, probably more. I prayed for God to save him. But what did God say? My grace is sufficient. But now I was angry at God. And I was angry probably for at least a year, probably more. And finally, I just figured, you know what? God knows everything. He knows how upset I am. He knows I'm angry. I don't need to fear him abandoning me. I don't need to fear him getting angry and striking me dead. Because he'd have already done it by now. Because he knows. He knows what's going on in my heart and in my head. And so I prayed to God, and I poured my anger out to him. And I said, I asked you, I begged you for years, for decades, to give me a happy childhood, to make me feel loved, to save my parents, to spare my sisters, to spare me from this. And you didn't. But had God not preserved me through abuse, had God not said, my grace is sufficient, and given me faith and given me hope, I wouldn't be here today. I would not be telling you all my story. I probably would never have met my husband. I would never have given birth to 3 beautiful little girls. Because when I was about 15, I really hit rock bottom. And I wanted to die. And I seriously considered suicide. But by the grace of God, he convinced me not to. Because when I was in that dark place, suicidal, I had just realized for the first time, I'd finally gone through puberty and I was a teenager, and suddenly I understood to a new degree what my dad's sexual sin meant. I understood what the porn was for. I understood what it meant that my own dad was attracted to me. And it disgusted me. And it broke my heart. And I didn't want to live with that anymore. But the verse came to mind, I will never leave you or forsake you. And so I decided to live. And because God worked that faith in my life, because God was with me in the valley of the shadow of death, I'm a stronger mom. I can protect my little girls from darkness. I wouldn't have met the people that I've met. I certainly wouldn't have written the book that, chronicles my recovery process. And so just as God used Joseph, and just as God used Paul's suffering to encourage the Ephesians, the Corinthians, the Romans, to show them that he is faithful and he is good, no matter how bad things get, so God uses my suffering. And you know what? That's really the story of Christ, isn't it? Jesus suffered for us, for the saving of many lives, for the saving of many souls. Just as Joseph was thrown into that pit, betrayed by his brothers, so Jesus was betrayed and plunged into the darkness of death. Just as Joseph was taken captive, so Jesus was taken captive. Just as Joseph was falsely accused and imprisoned, so Jesus was falsely accused and nailed to a criminal's cross. But just as Joseph was elevated out of his sorrow, out of his hardship, so Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. He was victorious over death itself, so that we too could rise. And so, you know, Paul talks about that thorn in the flesh. And we all have thorns in the flesh. Jesus had a crown of thorns. You know, my thorn was abuse. You know, it was depression. It was heartbreak. Maybe yours is battling health issues, surviving cancer. Maybe you endured a heartbreaking divorce. Maybe you've seen businesses go under. Maybe you've suffered financially. Maybe you've watched a child you love wander away from the faith. Whatever your suffering is, God uses it. Maybe to strengthen your own faith, right? Maybe to draw you closer to Him, to cause you to pray, to throw yourself on His mercy and His hope, to cling to Him alone. Maybe there are people you don't even know, you aren't even aware of, who see you enduring suffering, yet maintaining your faith and clinging to God. And because of your faith, they too come to know that there is a God who can get you through anything. There is a God who can heal any wound. Maybe it doesn't happen in this life. Maybe He heals us in heaven. But He is our great physician and our mighty counselor. I love that name for God. He's a counselor. You know, so many people said, oh, well, have you seen a counselor? Yeah, always. And I'm not knocking counseling. It's wonderful, but God is an awesome counselor. And so, if you're a Christian and you're here today, you can use your sorrow and use your experiences to glorify God, to honor Him, to empower others to look to Him too. And so we can say, like Joseph, we can say of those who wanted to harm us, who abused us, who betrayed us, who falsely accused us, who gossiped about us and lied about us, even the demons who wage spiritual warfare against us, and Satan himself, we can say they intended to harm us. But God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Thank you. Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question, but before I do, let me put it in context.
Okay.
This has been extremely moving to me personally.
Thank you.
In 2013, my daughter was brutally murdered. Her body butchered and burned in her fireplace by her fiance. I was very mad at God, just as you were. Then I realized, you know, He's the creator of the universe. You think He what's this lesson for me in my life?
Hmm.
And the first thing that came to mind is forgiveness. So my question is, have you forgiven your father?
You know, in a sense I have forgiven him, and in a sense I haven't, and I'll tell you why. There's been no repentance. And so when we talk about forgiveness, you have to understand forgiveness is a work of the Spirit. We were just talking about this. Yes, the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, grace, gentleness, self-control. These are things God empowers us to do. You know, it's easy, when someone spills coffee on your carpet to say, no, it's okay. It's okay, no big deal, you're forgiven. When someone damages you so profoundly, it's very difficult, and it's not natural to be okay with that. In fact, I would say it is absolutely healthy to be very angry. And we go through a grieving process, right? I'm sure you've heard of the 5 stages of grief. I went through this, with my dad. And I'm going to say them out of order. There's denial. I went through about 20 years of that, plus, probably more like 30 years. There's anger. There's depression. Oh, wait, there's bargaining somewhere in there where you say, oh, this can't be right, there's a mistake. And then there's acceptance. Anytime something terribly traumatic and abusive happens to us, we're going to go through those stages in different orders, maybe all at the same time, maybe one at a time, maybe bounce through a few. But we're going to go through those phases, and that's part of our recovery process. It's normal. And you know what? I want to also remind us of a Bible verse, and I believe it's in the Psalms. Maybe somebody can Google it for me. It says, God is angry at the wicked every day. So yeah, when you hear about murder, child abuse, rape, betrayal, God is angry about that. So it's not wrong to be angry. In fact, I would say if you're not angry, there's something wrong. You might be a sociopath. That was scary. The volume changed on me. So, it's important to understand that, we're created in the image of God. And so we're going to have the same emotions that God has. And God's going to be angry when he sees evil. I mean, he wiped out the whole earth with a flood at one point. But I would also say, it's not safe and it's not healthy for us to stay in anger and to live in anger. I'm trying to remember what verse it is. I believe it's Paul again, but he said, no, maybe it's John. But he says, be angry, but do not sin. And being angry it's exhausting. And after a while, I finally had to tell Jesus, you took my sin away. You carried my sin for me to the cross. I really need you to take my anger away and to carry my anger for me. And when we realize that God is just, that he judges evil people, when somebody doesn't repent ever, when they're not saved, and they die in that state of unrepentance, they will go to hell. They will face God's wrath because Jesus isn't facing it for them, right? The reason that we go to heaven is because Jesus took God's wrath so we wouldn't have to experience it. When someone's not clinging to Jesus, they're not claiming him as their mediator between God and man. And so it's just them and God, and that's a terrible place to be. But once we realize that God is just, once we realize that he is bigger than our abuser, that he's bigger than a murderer, He's bigger than the worst person we can possibly imagine. And this is not to say that I don't still get angry, and it's not to say that I don't still struggle against depression and anxiety and what ifs. What if I'd done something differently? What if I'd been a better daughter? What if I demanded that he go to therapy? Like, that would have gone over well. God is responsible and he is faithful. And we don't need to hold that anger inside because he feels it for us in the most righteous and holy way possible. And he will make sure that all evil is taken care of. And so that was a huge weight off my chest when I finally just said, Jesus, you bore my sin for me, now you can bear my anger as well. You can carry it for me so I don't have to feel it. So that's how I kind of coped with that struggle. But it's an ongoing thing. Yeah, it's not, it's grief that severe is not something that is, going to get fixed probably in this life. Until we're united again in heaven with the ones we love and with Jesus Christ. Then finally we will be made perfect and our tears will be wiped away. Yes?
Jen, a question. So you've been in the music industry for a while now.
Yes.
It's not the most, let's say, godly industry.
No.
Any thoughts on what you see and if you see God moving it all?
In the music industry? Whenever I'm releasing an album this year, but I've always been independent, and for that reason, actually. Because, I started recording albums when I was about 18 years old. And at that period of my life, I was not equipped or emotionally able to cope with all the perversion and corruption that was in the entertainment industry. And so I just basically decided, I'm going to be an indie artist, and I'm not going to deal with any of that stuff. I'm going to dress how I want to dress and, produce my own work and not have to worry about pressures like that. So that was kind of my way to deal with it. Now I feel like, if I were to work in a label or whatever, I'd be able to navigate, the industry. But at the time, I knew I wasn't able to. So. Anybody else? Yes?
You mentioned your mother. I wondered what part did you play? Just the silent part? And then you were homeschooled.
Yes.
You made that decision because to me, knowing of other situations, the
Yeah.
homeschooling was a cover-up to not let the children out to be able to speak to others.
Yeah, I originally, I went to kindergarten at a private school, but that became, I think it was a financial decision. My parents decided to keep us homeschooled, and I think I was a kid at the time, so it's really kind of hard for me to say for sure, but I believe it was a mutual decision. But yes, ultimately it wind up being a way of keeping secrets and a way of isolating us, because certainly, particularly after that story I told you about my dad beating me, a teacher would have seen those bruises, and so, yeah, it did, and it's funny because I'm a homeschool mom now, and that was a huge struggle for me to decide how to approach that. I was really kind of scared to homeschool after what I'd been through. But then I started thinking about sending my babies away, and I just couldn't do it. So I thought, okay, well, it's just kindergarten. I can teach them math, and ABCs and stuff like that. It's no big deal. So that's what we're doing now. But yeah, my mom, her role, I believe from her perspective, she believed that if she was a faithful wife and very loving, that my dad would eventually change, that he would see God's love in her and that he would come to know God. And so she never told and never got help. And, particularly after I had my own kids and realized that maternal instinct to protect your children, that was very hard for me to deal with, that decision that she made, and really made many, many times. So it caused quite a bit of damage in our relationship. Anyone else? Oh, you want me to sing? Well, if I put the mic kind of over here and I stand far away.
Yeah, maybe that'll work. Don't touch it.
Yeah, don't touch it. All right, let's see. What do you think? How firm a foundation? A good one? Okay. Probably everybody knows that one. How firm a foundation, you saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in his excellent word. What more can he say than to you he has said? To you for refuge, to Jesus hath fled. Thank you. Thank you all very much for having me today. I sincerely appreciate it. Thank you to Paul especially for being so encouraging. Thank you all for being here and for listening, to hear my story. And I sincerely hope it blesses you. Thank you. Oh, yes. My book is called Not Forsaken, and it will be available on August 20th. It's already available for a pre-sale. So you can check out my website at jennifergreenberg.net. Somebody already took the .com. It's not like it's a common name, right? So yes, jennifergreenberg.net, and it's available for pre-order on Amazon and via The Good Book Company, which is my publisher. So, thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. A foundation, you saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in his